The individual in that video mentioned a leaky gut, but what actually is leaky gut? This is the lining of your small intestine. Okay, this chart might be a little bit easier to decipher. This is the lumen of your small intestine where food enters after it is partially digested inside of the stomach. Food is then absorbed through this layer of cells, under which lies an immune system, and then food can be absorbed into the bloodstream, or in the case of dietary fat, within the lymph system, but that is outside the scope of this video. If we zoom into the space between these cells, we see there are junction proteins that keep food from passing in between these cells. Leaky gut is a simplistic mainstream term for what is referred to as intestinal permeability. A leaky gut is when the barrier between these cells is compromised, leading to inadequate junction formation and allowing large molecules to simply pass in between these cells. This allows for things like microorganisms, toxins, gut bacteria, and undigested food particles to enter into the bloodstream and induce a hormonal, immune, nervous, respiratory, or reproductive response. Normally, the intestinal barrier only allows for certain nutrients in and restricts the entrance of pathogens and other large molecules. Importantly, 70 to 80% of our immune system is located within the gastrointestinal tract, and when bacteria or partially digested food molecules pass through the gastrointestinal tract, they are essentially looked at as pathogens the same way we would look at an infectious agent. These molecules activate the immune system and are associated with a myriad of dysfunctions, including inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, diabetes, heart disease, obesity, celiac disease, and multiple autoimmune diseases such as type 1 diabetes. And they affect our insulin sensitivity and multiple organs, including the liver, fat, skeletal muscle, and brain. So what are the most common things that cause the gut to go from this to this? One of the most common is celiac disease. The ingestion of gluten in patients with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity appear to increase the permeability of the gastrointestinal tract. The ingestion of food allergens specific to the individual also increase the permeability of the gastrointestinal tract. Infections such as H. pylori, obesity, sleep apnea and other sleep disorders, diabetes, chronic stress, and heavy metals also increase gastrointestinal permeability. One thing that is unpopular to talk about is the ingestion of an extremely high saturated fat meal. A meal that is high in saturated fat appears to induce transient gastrointestinal dysbiosis and appears to stimulate pro-inflammatory signaling cascades. Dysbiosis is essentially an imbalance between the supposedly good and bad bacteria, and this appears to be one of the main driving factors for an increased intestinal permeability. After the consumption of a very high-fat meal, we see what is called endotoxemia. This is essentially the entrance of bacteria into the bloodstream coming from the gastrointestinal tract. Compared to a meal just containing glucose, an extremely high-fat, high-saturated fat meal appears to increase endotoxemia, correlated with an increased gastrointestinal permeability. This is in no way saying you cannot consume fat or saturated fat, but if you feel poor after an extremely high-fat meal, this may be one of the reasons. In addition to dietary fat, it also appears that processed foods can also contribute to this gut dysbiosis. Interestingly, it appears that extremely high-intensity exercise induces acute gastrointestinal permeability. However, non-prolonged, moderate-intensity exercise may actually improve gastrointestinal barrier function. However, we don't currently have a threshold that may or may not lead to gut permeability. With that being said, some researchers actually hypothesize that this is a hormetic effect of exercise, because although exercise stimulates acute gastrointestinal permeability, in the long run, it appears to improve the gut microbiome, which actually induces improvements in gut barrier function. However, it is seen that patients with gastrointestinal disorders or pre-existing conditions such as chronic fatigue syndrome do see a worsening of symptoms following exercise associated with intestinal permeability. So it's simply something to be mindful of. What this data suggests is that you may not want to be eating food during high-intensity exercise. And if you find that you have a worsening of gastrointestinal or fatigue-related symptoms after exercise, this could be one of the mechanisms. With that being said, there are tens if not hundreds of other things that could induce this increased intestinal permeability, but these factors appear to be the most common. With that being said, there are a myriad of things that we can actually do to improve our gastrointestinal barrier function. Therefore, stick around for the next video.